in the building.
Yeah, and I'm leaving. I've got. No, I've got until 11. Yeah.
We are live. Okay, so good morning. Today is April 19th, 2022. It is 10:40 a.m. and we're taking up H411, an act related to retrieval and use of covered animals. And to introduce the bill, we have Chair of House Natural Resources, Fish and Wildlife, Representative Sheldon. So if you could take it away, please.
Thank you and good morning. And for the record, yes, Amy Sheldon, Chair of House Natural Resources, Fish and Wildlife, something like that. So this bill actually is will codify what the majority of Vermont hunters already practice, and that is only killing animals they intend to use. It's a law enforcement tool to prevent the killing of an animal without the intent to use it. And it's important to know that 29 other states already have laws against the wasting of legally taken animals. 29. So each year, game wardens report to us report that between 60 and 90 instances of wasted game that they're aware of are happening. And the bill will limit the wasting of game by making it a violation to kill a covered wild animal and not use it. So as the title of the bill indicates, related to retrieval and use of covered wild animals. And so it's very important to go to that definition of covered wild animal, which our legislative council, I'm sure, will walk you through. But those are essentially animals that already have a regulated season in the state of Vermont. That's how you know. But there's a number of categories of covered wild animal, and they include big game animal, game quadruped, game bird, or fur-bearing animal, or crow. These categories are defined in statute, and like I said, Michael Grady will give you the list of exactly what species are in each category.
Fur-bearing, does that include coyotes?
Yes.
Okay.
So essentially, there are definitions of covered wild animal in the bill: processed or processed, and unfit for consumption or use. The bill has requirements, and it requires someone who kills a covered wild animal to make a reasonable effort to retrieve, use, and legally dispose of it. There are several exceptions in the bill to the requirements, and they're based on situations that are beyond the control of the person, the hunter, due to theft, weather, unavoidable loss to a wild animal, or lack of legal access to the property. Other exceptions that are in the law allows for the defense of persons or property when the animal is sick or diseased, an exception for state or federal municipal law enforcement when following generally accepted hunting practices for the retrieval of a covered wild animal. And coyotes not trapped are not required to be used under this bill, but are required to be retrieved. And then there's a disposal section: covered wild animals shall not be dumped along a public right of way on legally posted land or where prohibited by state or municipal law. And finally, the effective dates it becomes effective on passage. And that's an overview of bill. The House worked on this bill for a number of years, at least 3, and had a stakeholder group that was set up, and Michael Grady was part of that. The previous commissioner was part of that, and Carol Odie from our committee kind of facilitated and made sure it happened. We had stakeholders. Mike Covey was part of it, and Humane Society, blanking on the gentleman's name from the Humane Society, but yeah, Barry Laundere, thank you. So that group had a number of meetings over essentially a whole session, and then 411 kind of grew out of those conversations. And we have a new commissioner enter the conversation, and then you have before you H411. It passed the House on the floor without any debate and unanimously, just a voice vote, but unanimously. So a lot of history with this bill, and I hope you can support it, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Well, you come in here with a bit of tailwind because on March 13th, 2020, we were in the process of voting out a one bill. So, so thank you for hanging and continuing to work on it. Any committee questions about the bill?
No, I feel like I must know it well. Past years and try to work on it. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, sort of, you know, when people ask me about it, and with some concern, I'd say every hunter I know who has a real sort of hunting ethic supports the respectful use of any animal taken. So, thank you for making that explicit. Okay. All right, with that,
Thanks for having me.
sorry for all the tough questions.
Thanks, Ed.
Yeah, you're welcome.
You're welcome.
Mr. O'Grady.
Sure, absolutely.
Mr. O'Grady, good. See you. Could you go, please? Thank you.
So do you all have the as passed by House version?
Yes.
So this is Michael Grady with the Office of Legislative Counsel. As the chair of House Natural just went through, H411 establishes requirements for the retrieval and use and disposal of covered wild animals that are intentionally, knowingly, or recklessly killed as part of hunting. You will see that there is a definition of covered wild animals, as Representative Sheldon noted. It cross-references terms that are already defined in statute. I have provided the committee with this document, which sets forth all of the terms for being used and what is covered under those definitions. So it is a covered wild animal is big game, game quadruped, game bird, fur-bearing animal, etc. A big game animal includes deer, bear, moose, wild turkey, caribou, elk, and Atlantic salmon. Game quadruped is elk, moose, deer, gray squirrel, rabbit, black bear. Game bird is quail, partridge, woodcock, pheasant, plover, Wilson snipe, other shorebirds, rail coot, galamule, wild ducks, wild geese, and wild turkey. And a fur-bearing animal is beaver, otter, marten, mink, raccoon, fisher, fox, skunk, coyote, bobcat, weasel, possum, lynx, wolf, and muskrat. Crow is not defined in statutes or in the Fish and Wildlife Board rules. There are only two types of crow in the state, according to the Department of Fish and Wildlife. One is the American crow, and the other is the Fisher crow. I'd have to check that out.
So you got me a new one here, a galamule.
Yeah, they kind of have the feathered, they look kind of like a swimming woodpecker. Like think of Woody the Woodpecker swimming around. That's what a galamule kind of looks like.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask one other thing? So when the chair Chair Sheldon was introducing, she mentioned in terms of covered wild animals with a season, but
Animals with what?
Animals with a season, an established season.
Mhm.
And so I don't know if that's part of why I asked about coyotes, because I don't know if we legally say that we have a season for coyotes, it happens to be open, or we haven't defined season. So,
well, I think what the chair was saying is that basically the covered wild animals that are regulated under the bill generally have a season, but the bill doesn't say it has to have a season or the animal must be taken during the season. In addition, when there is an exception in the bill, because there was concern among certain interested parties that a coyote that's taken outside the trapping season really can't be used for anything. Its fur, its hide is not usable, and it's really only usable when it is trapped during the trapping season. So there is an exception that's built in to the use provision for coyote that are taken outside of the trapping season.
And I'll wait, so, but I'm guessing, I'm guessing we'll get to talk about how to dispose of animals taken in part of nuisance.
Sure, so yes. Should I just walk through the bill?
Yes, please.
The first section is definitions. You just walked through the most relevant definition. The section is the requirements for retrieval of a covered wild animal. So a person shall not intentionally, knowingly, or recklessly kill the covered wild animal and intentionally or knowingly fail to make a reasonable effort to retrieve the covered wild animal and use the covered wild animal provided under the subchapter. So there's that requirement for retrieval of a covered wild animal. Then you get to page 2, 4923. These are the requirements for use. A person who retrieves the lawfully taken covered wild animal, or a person to whom the lawfully taken covered wild animal is transferred, shall retain the animal until this processed as food, processed for fur, hide, or feathers for use for taxidermy. There was concern from some uninterested parties that use provision would apply to the entire animal, and that there are certain parts of the animal that are unusable. So that second sentence in subsection A was added, that the inedible or unusable parts or portions of a covered wild animal produced from processing of the covered wild animal shall be disposed of pursuant to the requirements of the subchapter. So it doesn't need to be used, but it does need to be disposed of. And then you get to the requirements. There are some specific exceptions to the use of covered wild animals. One is when the animal is unfit for consumption and for use. And there is a definition of unfit for consumption. It's a part of the covered animal, or the covered animal itself is decayed, rotting, diseased, or infected. So there's no requirement to use a decayed, rotting, diseased, or infected animal or part of an animal. And then, as I referenced earlier, the use requirements do not apply to coyote taken by a lawful means other than trapping, provided that the coyote is retrieved and disposed of pursuant to the requirements of the subchapter. So if you are out hunting a coyote with a rifle, shotgun, bow and arrow, crossbow, you are not required to use the coyote, but you need to retrieve it and lawfully dispose of it.
Okay, and I'm just pausing to think through. So we passed S281. I'm told the House will also be passing. I don't know, would change or not, but since you've worked on both, do you see any inconsistency between this division and how the rulemaking might emerge? Well, I guess this would control anyway.
Right, I don't see, because this is when the animal has been taken, has been killed, actually, is the kills. And so will 281 set requirements for how coyote are pursued, taken, and ultimately killed? Yes, and that's part of the rule, but once they're killed, this H411 would apply. Now, you do have a provision in the rule that says any killed coyote in S281 needs to be reported. So, but that doesn't conflict, in my belief, with H411.
They seem compatible, but I just wanted to not sort of have us unintentionally work at cross purposes. Thank you. I'll get it.
Then there are exceptions to both the use and retrieval. The first is when the failure to retrieve, failure to establish, or the failure to retain the covered wild animals beyond the control of the person due to theft of the covered wild animal by another person, unavoidable loss in the field to a wild animal, lack of legal access to property where a wounded or dead covered wild animal is located, including when signage on the property would lead a reasonable person to believe that hunting is prohibited on the land, and other circumstances that would prevent salvage, retrieval, or retention.
Can you distinguish what's the difference between retrieve and salvage? Why do we have both?
They're basically, one is, remember, because this is an exception to retrieve and use. So there's, have to provide the exception from retrieve, and then you have to provide the except. Salvage is just the word that's used in the section for the use provision. There's also an exception in order to defend a person or property, including the defense of property authorized for, as you referenced, nuisance control. When the covered wild animal is sick or diseased, to state or federal or municipal law enforcement officer operating within the course of their employment. And when following generally accepted hunting or trapping practices for retrieval of a covered wild animal. Now, when you go and look at kind of academic articles on the use of animals, or you go and look at websites where there's discussions on it, the term generally accepted hunting or trapping practices is often used as an exception. But in the House, they wanted to build some detail around what that means. And so they added those subdivisions 5A and B. It's one that is set forth in the statute or the rules adopted under the park. So there are provisions about if you're going to field dress and how you do field dressing. So those are generally accepted hunting practices. But then if there's something that's not in statute or rule, or for example, could be something that's, it would also be considered a generally accepted hunting or trapping practice that would be allowed as an exception.
And this is focused on the retrieval portion.
It's use or retrieval. These are exceptions for use or retrieval.
Okay. So the lead-in language is in 5, hunting or trapping practices for retrieval when the practice is, but the whole section.
The whole section is use.
Includes use as well. Okay.
So moving on, there is that section 4925, which relates to disposal. A person shall not safely dump or abandon the carcass or parts of a covered wild animal on public right of way or highway, on private property that's posted as a safety zone or is posted against hunting or trapping without permission of the owner or the owner's agent, and where prohibited by state or municipal law, and then the act shall take effect on passage.
We have instances in state or municipal law that prohibit disposal.
I'm sorry?
Sorry, the sub 3, where we're covering state or municipal law that prohibits disposal. Are there such laws on the books already?
That's an interesting question. There are certain laws that apply just to the disposal of waste. And so if disposal of waste is prohibited, then it's also prohibited for carcasses, etc., of wild animals. There are individual solid waste districts or solid waste management entities that have their own provisions regarding this disposal of carcasses, and they have requirements for that. There isn't any state-specific solid waste law other than general requirements for waste that apply to carcasses.
So this is focused on animals killed in hunting. So, I've seen big piles that look like animal or parts of animals that have come from slaughter. So they are not addressed.
From slaughter, no.
Any questions for Mr. Grady?
This is all wild animals.
Just covered wild animals. It does not apply to livestock or
I just,
domestic animals.
thank you.
Okay, so I'm gonna pause to ask the inevitable, or here on the floor, skunk question. I shoot a skunk. Do I have to use it or eat it or save it for, I think I know the answer here, but can you just make sure I know the answer properly? Thank you.
Skunk are harvested for a couple of particular uses. Their oil is used in a couple of different kind of scents and other uses.
Yeah.
And their fur is used as well. So they are, I would say there's probably a small set of people that hunt them for those uses, but they do.
Okay, so, but in the exception section, when the sub 2, in order to defend a person or property, including defend the property authorized under this part or rules adopted. So if someone's there because there's a nuisance skunk, they trap that skunk, they kill that skunk, or however they, I don't know if they relocate or they kill, but either way, well, like a killing.
There are requirements
Yeah.
in the rules that the General Assembly added a few, required the board to add a few years ago regarding how a person that's trapping for compensation to control or control nuisance and defend property has to comply with the law. They do have to basically properly use or dispose of the animal.
Okay. All right, so that one, I'd like to follow up with just a little later, if you could send me like the site to where that is, so that have that totally clear. All right. Thank you. Any other questions for Mr. Grady?
Yeah,
Chairman McCormick?
and the defenses, the exceptions. In order to defend a person or property, including defense of property authorized under this part or rules adopted under this part. What is that referring to, Laura?
The part is in the way that the statutes are organized, there's a title, a part, a chapter, a section. And so all of the fish and wildlife requirements and statute are in Title 10, Part 4, but it extends over multiple chapters. So there are provisions in statute, Title 10, Part 4, that authorize the defense of a person or property. And so those are being referenced. And then the Fish and Wildlife Board rules and the Commissioner's rules are also authorized under 10 VSA Part 4. So when it references this part, it means the statutes for fish and wildlife or the rules adopted under the statutes authorizing.
I apologize, I wasn't clear what I was asking.
Okay.
I was asking more for, what do we mean by defend a person or property?
So there's a provision in law regarding the defense of property from nuisance wildlife. And so that's the reference there.
And what does it refer to?
It refers to nuisance wildlife.
Okay, so like going out on coyotes.
No, it's when there's a threat to your property from the proximity of that animal.
Well, people would say that about coyotes.
If I recall correctly, I'll have to look at the nuisance wildlife rule to see specifically what animals are referenced.
A skunk onto the porch spraying my dog.
Yes, the nuisance beaver, even rabbits.
What about a bear getting into your garbage?
If you are going to take a bear that's doing damage to property, that is in another statute regarding animal doing damage. There's a bear doing damage. statute. And so if you want to take that there, you have to follow that statute. And there's a deer doing damage statute. If you want to take deer that are a nuisance, you have to follow that statute. So those are all referenced with this citation.
So isn't all this already covered then?
It's authorized, but it's not, without having it as an exception, you don't know if that's an exception.
So this is for everything that wasn't authorized through the exception, deer, bear, et cetera. Okay. And one, just to follow up on this notion of defense, is a sense of, I remember talking to someone who had young children, and then they saw coyotes, and they felt like since their dog had been attacked by coyotes, that their kids aren't much bigger than their dog. And so does that sense of concern constitute, does that mean, okay, now I have a legitimate concern, so my defense can be taking that coyote? In other words, you don't have to have lost chickens or something, but you could just be worried, and you could, coyotes have come up a lot this year, so I'll stick with coyotes.
Yeah, some of this is going to be fact specific depending on the warden's investigation of the matter. Remember, these violations are crimes, the wardens are criminal investigators, and so they will have to make those, have an inspection,
Yeah.
have an investigation, determine the facts, and apply the law to the facts. That's basically how crimes work.
Yeah. Thank you. Any other questions for Mr. O'Grady?
No, thank you.
Oh, all right. Thanks again. Mr. Commissioner, welcome back. Good to see you.
Good to see everybody. For the record, I'm Christopher Herrick, Commissioner of the Department of Fish and Wildlife. It's nice to see your eye looks better.
Thanks. It's feeling better too. Thank you.
So I think what I'd like to mention with respect, I'd like to echo some of the testimony from Chair Sheldon that this bill had been languishing around the State House for 3 or 4 years. And I thought that when I met with folks at the department, that this was an important bill to move forward. And so just like the department did in this committee on some of the bills that came out successfully, we worked with the chair and the committee and Mr. O'Grady to come up with a solution that was workable, because we felt it was a good position for the department to be in support of not having wanton waste. And so I think that's important to note. There was a lot of work done on this to get to this point. Is the department completely happy? Nope, nobody is. And maybe that's the way it should work. I think we've reached a very reasonable compromise. And I think it's good to note that on the front end of the testimony. The other thing I would like to mention is that with respect to coyotes, I know that that's an issue. The Fish and Wildlife Board was presented with a petition. I think it was April 6th, but it was the beginning of the month, to consider a quiet season on coyote hunting. And it passed with, I think, one maybe no vote or almost unanimously. That is a signal. We're going to have these serious discussions about that. So that's going to be coming up on the Fish and Wildlife Board. That is a move in the direction. So I look at that. The reason I bring it up here is I think it bridges the question that you asked, Senator, with respect to this bill and the one that's over in the House now. Is that we've deconflicted to a large extent And I think when you look at the package of what's going on here, if we move this bill as it looks right now, we're doing the good work. So that's really the substance of my testimony, and of course, I'll answer any and all questions.
Well, we haven't finished, we haven't adjourned, we haven't seen bills become law yet, but compared to prior sessions where things sort of ground to a halt in conflict, feels like essentially a promising year to start to bring different points of view together to make progress.
Well stated, and that is exactly the right message.
And I'm guessing it's still just as true, or maybe even more so, when some of the testimony we had for years ago, whatever it was, that many hunters felt this way about hunting, ethical hunting to begin with. So I think some people bristled that we would even need to say it out loud. But
So I guess my response to that, and I may be off target, no pun intended, I believe, and this is based purely anecdotally, but I have a long history with the hunting community. The very large percentage of hunters are ethical hunters.
Mhm.
And I think that's what needs to be represented.
a lot of support for that. So, okay. Any questions for Commissioner Herrick?
Well, thank you for your consideration. You all know how to get a hold of me if you have any questions outside the committee, and I will come back anytime to answer
Okay,
any and all questions.
great. Thank you again.
Thank you.
And thanks again for shepherd the bills that we worked with you on the other side. And happy to see you back on this side. So we're sending things to each other, the other body. So that's great. Okay, with that, I'd like to go to Mr. Storrow, who's online with us today. Good morning, Mr. Storrow.
Morning, committee. Thank you very much for listening to me this morning. My name is Chuck Storrow. I'm with Leonine Public Affairs, and I'm here on behalf of the Vermont Wildlife Coalition. Is my audio coming through okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. The Vermont Wildlife Coalition is a group of Vermonters who are interested in wildlife management issues. It does support, with some exceptions, hunting. However, it does oppose recreational trapping. H411, as passed by the House, most certainly represents progress. It stands for the principle that one should only kill a wild animal outside of the context of defense of person or property if one is going to use the animal for food, or use its pelt, or for taxidermy purposes. So that's an important ethical statement, and H411, as passed by the House, generally embodies that, and therefore we're supportive of it in that regard. It does, however, have a flaw, and that is on the issue of coyotes. The bill accepts from the prohibition on wanton waste coyotes. They do have to be retrieved and disposed of as provided for in the bill, but they don't have to be used. And really, the hunting coyotes is for no purpose other than to kill the animal. People don't eat coyotes, and they don't use hunted coyotes pelts. So therefore, we would prefer that coyotes are included in the bill. But we recognize the reality around this situation, that as a political matter, that may not necessarily be possible. I didn't know that the Fish and Wildlife Board would be considering a petition to establish a season on coyotes. That's welcome news. That was going to be one of the asks that I make, that if coyotes were not to be included within the prohibition against wanton waste, that there at least be a season on them. I know that this committee in passing S-281 directed the Fish and Wildlife Board to consider the idea of there being a season on coyotes. It would be our preference that the board not be directed to just merely consider establishing such a season, but it be directed to affirmatively establish a season. But if they are going to do that anyways, then I suppose that problem will solve itself. But I see no harm in providing in the bill that the board establish a season, and that season, or that in doing that, the idea of baiting coyotes be prohibited. Beyond that, there's a couple small things in the bill. One thing that I do want to say before getting to those is that the bill does provide that crows are protected against wanton waste, and we think that's important too. There really is no reason to kill crows other than in situations where, say, a farmer's protecting its newly planted cornfield, which the bill would allow. So we would respectfully ask that the committee keep crows in the ambit of the bill. So the only other change I would suggest is in section subdivision 5, 4924, there's a provision that basically says that there's an exception for matters that fall within best practices as defined by the commissioner. We would submit that that should be in writing from the Department of Fish and Wildlife. That just simply saying as defined by the commissioner is a little bit too vague as to what format that would take. And in that regard, I analogize to the Department of Financial Regulation, which issues bulletins that provide interpretive guidance on statutes, and perhaps the definition of what best practices are in this regard should be established in writing in bulletins issued by the Fish and Wildlife Department. So with those comments, I have nothing else to add at this point, and appreciate you hearing me, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay. Thank you very much. Any committee questions for Mr. Storrow? Do you know if the suggestions, the edits that you're proposing here today, were they presented in the House committee as the bill was developed? Do you know?
Yes, well, there was some discussion around these issues. There was discussion about the issue of whether or not coyotes should be covered. And the decision was made to do what, as the bill shows, what it does relative to coyotes. On the best practices issue, it was originally, the idea was that they would be set forth in the department's hunting and fishing guidebooks. The department didn't feel that was the appropriate format for those best practices to be set forth. I have no comment one way or another on that. It sounded logical. So it was that language talking about putting best practices in those guidebooks was taken out of the bill. And it just simply says, as determined by the commissioner. And so at this juncture, we are, proposing the idea of that at least being written down so that it's knowable by all concerned.
Okay. Thank you very much. Any questions for Mr. Storrow? All right, thank you so much for coming back in. I also want to let people know that when I was calling Mr. Storrow, I passed over Mr. Covey's name, and that's because something came up with him, and he has not been able to join us. If he does join us while this morning, we'll certainly add him back in. But for the moment, he is unable to participate in the meeting. And Commissioner, I'm just wondering if you have, since we have a little time, if we could discuss the point that Mr. Storrow just mentioned about best practices. When you define best practice, thank you for rejoining us. When you define best practice, how does the public find out what those are?
We would obviously publish that. I mean, we don't do things in secret and enforce them. So the reason, Senator, that we said we didn't want to have to put it in the guidebook, those are out already this year for the whole year. And so it sets up a huge delay. And so we may have some best practices that we establish this summer, but then we wouldn't be able to implement them until January, and then it really wouldn't come around again until the fall in some cases. So an example that Mr. O'Grady started to mention, you field dress big game, and you leave that in the field. Well, that's not considered wanton waste because that's a best practice. And so that's why, but whatever those are will be certainly published and then put up on our website. And we have a very both interactive and well-utilized website where our rules and regulations are available. So we would make it very clear, I can assure you of that.
Okay, great. And since, so field dressing, since I'm not a nerd, just know some things about it, is that partly, mostly to get heat out of the animal?
Sure.
And also the, I was gonna say, the intestines and stuff is where you could get infections. So
Okay, you don't want to spoil the meat.
Yeah.
And so, especially early fall, when we're doing archery season, the temperatures can be, in the 40s and 50s. And that's when you start getting spoilage of meat. Nobody wants that. That's what we're talking about here, is waste. And so the best practice is to do it right there.
Yeah.
Same with, so we're talking about white-tailed deer, bear, turkey, so on.
Okay, great, all right. Thank you for jumping back in. Any questions, Commissioner, on the publication issue? Would you anticipate that in the following season, it would be part of the guide?
So if we created a new best practice in the interim, yeah, I would think so. I mean, it makes sense if it's significant and going to impact a lot of folks, we would want to do that. Yes. And the other thing I can tell you is, let's say we created a best practice tomorrow for whatever it is. I'm not going to speculate on a particular item. We've done a lot of work. We've met with hunters and so on and so forth, and scientists, and decided that going forward, we must recommend this. We also have an incredibly active outreach program, and they would notify folks, this is what's coming up. Well, for instance, the hound hunting of coyote bill. There's going to if that passes, there'll be a moratorium. Well, it's going to be on us to notify people there's a moratorium. And so we have those mechanisms in place. We don't want hunters not having the information, or anybody for that matter. So we'll promulgate it in a way that if you don't know it, it's really on you.
Great. Thank you.
Great. Thank you again.
And with that, we'll go back to guests on the screen. Mr. Bradley, good morning.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you. For the record, my name is Chris Bradley, and I'm the President and Executive Director of the Vermont Federation of Sportsmen's Clubs. I'm also a registered lobbyist for the Federation, with the Federation being an umbrella organization representing over 53 member clubs across the great state of Vermont with over 14,000 dues-paying members. I wish to thank Chair Bray, and by extension Judith, for the invitation to speak today on 4/11. I thank the committee members for this time, and I promise to be brief and very succinct. While few bills are perfect, with H411, the House Natural Resources Fish and Wildlife Committee produced a bill that provides wanton waste protection for a wide variety of game species of Vermont, including all big game. And this is a huge step forward in the management of our wildlife. If there was a turning point in this bill, we believe it came with the removal of coyote from the consideration of wanton waste, something we suggested and we fully support. While some have and will argue that we as humans should leave coyotes completely alone because we are told that coyote population would self-regulate, allowing coyote to achieve that population level would have serious consequences, which would include the decimation of smaller game species, increased issues with disease and starvation, and would drive out species like fox, who coyotes share habitat with. As they expand their territory and lose fear of humans, they will push further and further into urban environments. And with that push will come a significantly higher level of negative human-coyote interactions than will be tolerated by most citizens. While removing coyote from this bill is most assuredly not supported by all stakeholders can hopefully agree that we have gained critically important protections for a wide range of other species. And in specific regard to coyote, we know there will be new rules and regulations forthcoming that will specifically concern coyote hunting through bills like S281. And we thank the committee for the hard work on that. If we were to suggest a change, it would be for this committee to consider removing crow from the definition of covered wild animal. However, while we would encourage consideration of such an amendment, given the scope of protection provided to all of the other species, we support this bill, even with crow included. To close, the Federation supports H411 as written. We would like to specifically recognize and thank House Natural Resources Fish and Wildlife Committee for their dedication in constructing a bill that is also supported by the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. And we hope that this committee will also support it as written. Thank you. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Any committee questions for Mr. Bradley?
That was terrific.
Right.
Thank you so much for your time and for your hard work, both on the 3 bills that just came out of your committee, as well as for this bill as well. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it's a pleasure to have a meeting where all the parties have ironed out the major wrinkles, and it's not the norm, at least in the early going of most fish and wildlife bills. So thanks to you and your organization, your members, for participating. It seems like a season in which cooler heads have prevailed, and we've made some real progress in the collection of bills. All right. Any committee questions for Mr. Bradley? Seeing none.
Thank you very much for your time.
That is our last witness. And Mr. Commissioner, sorry. Let's see.
Oh, did you need to stay?
Well, I didn't ask you the key question that I should have, and it's, I think I know the answer, but I want to be explicit. So the Fish and Wildlife Department supports 411 as passed by the House. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. That's all I need to ask. So committee, this is the last full week of
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah. And because I knew that there was a lot of agreement on this bill before we're taking it up this morning, I listed this as committee testimony would be impossible to vote. And although it's an up-tempo schedule, but we also are running an up-tempo week. So I don't want to rush in any way, but so let me just ask you all, do you feel like you heard enough that you're feeling comfortable voting, or would you like to schedule a vote for later in the week? Senator McDonald? Is that thumbs up for moving forward? Senator Campion? Anyone else? Okay. So, we're making no changes, so looking for a motion to report favorably H411 and activity people and use of covered animals as passed by the House.
So move.
Thanks, Senator McDonald. second, Senator Westman. Any further discussion? All right, clerk will call the roll, please.
Senator McDonald,
Yes.
Senator McCormick,
Yes,
Senator Westman,
Yes.
Senator Campion votes yes, Senator Bray.
Yes. And I would actually like to report this bill after taking a swing at this piñata over multiple years.
Well, congrats. It does take a few swings sometimes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, committee.
By the way, although I'm coughing, I've tested, but
So that
we'll just get sick with something else.
no, I feel fine. It's the end of something.
That concludes our business on 411. We don't get to see Mr. Grady very often. Does anyone have any questions for him while we're working forward? Because we're also going to see you on dollar bill and sorry.
501.
501, thank you. The regulation of food packaging facilities. So we do have this trouble of a depackaging facility grinding up food in containers.
Oh, right.
Bits of container ending up in the stream. We have S282. The House did a version, their own version, which is H501. We've got, that's come over to us, and I'm hoping we will take a little testimony and consider how to address that. Which the urgency to me is that once those materials are ground up, brought into the field and field applied, however many intervening steps, they will never be recovered.
Right.
And we will run permanent risks of damaging crops for animals and for people. So, okay. Thank you, Mr. Grady. I think that's it. Do you have anything you want to point out for us since you're?
Well, you asked what the section was for
Yes.
nuisance wildlife
Yep.
and the requirements.
Yeah.
It's 10 VSA 4828. It applies to rabbits and fur bearers that are trapped.
Okay.
So in for coyote, for example, you would have to have a trapping license. And we'd be trapping during the trapping season.
Okay.
And then if you were trapping for compensation and you have help, you have to notify
I'd
the
love
ordinance
rabies.
of that, including of your intent to dispose of the help.
Okay.
And then your requirement for how to dispose of it would be governed by 411.
Okay. And that,
And then general solid waste management law,
okay. And it was 4828.
4828.
Okay, thank you. All right, great. So I did want to bring up another subject, and that is H446. I'm sorry, 466. A little trouble with these numbers. They're so similar. Surface water withdrawals and interbasin transfers. So the Ag Committee, we've all been getting notes from farmers who are saying they're concerned about the bill. We made adjustments. I think we did solid work on the bill. I think we have a very reasonable proposal going forward. All that said, there are still colleagues who are getting plenty of emails on it, and Senator Starr has asked if we would refer the bill to them because they'd like to look at it and possibly make further proposals of amendment. So
Refer or to
to refer,
pause and allow him
No.
to take a look.
not interested in pausing and refer. So I talked with Senator Starr and the pro tem. I know. So this is, a bit of an act of faith at this point to send the bill. As assured, the goal is not to kill the bill, but it's to give the Ag Committee a chance to have that formal status of possessing the bill, taking testimony, proposing amendments, and bringing it back out. So, although I have concerns, I wanted to get the hear the committee's thoughts on doing that. You know, like I think over and over again, we're always trying to appeal to the best side of what we all do. And so I would like to just hear your thoughts about doing that.
Is there a commitment to get it out by the end of the week?
He thought he would be able to have it out by the end of the week. So maybe we need a stronger commitment of thinking to have it out by the end of the week.
I think I might go to Florida next week. It's not gonna happen.
Darren McDonald. Struck out there. So, you know, I would like to accommodate the concern. I think it would also be helpful to.
What is the concern exactly?
Well,
Because I think that needs to be illustrated, that some answers need to happen and, you know, get business before all of a sudden. Right, yeah, I'm just not sure if what the concern is exactly. So maybe if you would share the concern, then we could feel as though we have those questions answered.
Sure. Well,
Hearing from people isn't usually enough.
and we are a single committee senate, so it's an unusual gesture, which I'm, you know, willing to consider as long as it's done, you know, with good intent, as in, this is not to hold the bill, this is not to, it's, yeah, so the concern is over, I think, one of the things that happened is, I think, and I'm trying to get a copy of it now, I've had two people, they're gonna send it to me. I think there's been misinformation circulated, which is called undue concern in the agricultural community about the implications of the bill. And I don't think I understand how someone could be misinformed and then more worried than they ought to be about the bill. The inventory is just an inventory.
I think people are misinformed about the bill.
Yes.
And I don't think that this committee has not tried to hear from the vegetable growers, the fruit growers, and all of that. But I am getting stuff. You know, I just got an email not 10 minutes ago from somebody saying that farmers have not been heard, and this is disproportionately affected by this vague bill. I don't believe any of that. I think if Senator Starr would sit in front of the President Pro Tem with you and tell you the bill was out by the end of the week,
That's a different story.
that I would let it go down. But I think he needs to be in front of the President Pro Tem with you and give you a promise it would be out.
Okay, I like that idea. Senator McCall.
Thanks. At my request, Jude gave me the list of our witnesses, and perhaps everybody should have that list. It includes berry farmers. It does include farmers.
Sure.
So this is not a difference of opinion, it's misinformation. The other thing in terms of, I think Senator Starr is sort of the face and name to personify the situation, but the situation is at least 50 years old. And it is that in Vermont, there has been a sense among elements of the agricultural community that environmental protections, however modest, are fundamentally an attack on agriculture. And they are very defensive about it. In this case, the defensiveness, I think, is indefensible because we are a riparian state. It's not the farmer's water. No one is intruding on his rights. It's not his water. But I don't think a lot of people get that. I don't think I think the word riparian is used all the time, but in terms of, I think it's a somewhat obscure concept to a lot of people. And but all that said, I think this is an agricultural bill. I don't see how we can say no in good conscience when the chair of agriculture wants it. I don't know how we block it. It has implications for farming. And
so, okay, so I will sit down with Senator Starr and the pro tem, and if we can't get a promise to move it by the end of the week, then I'll decline to refer.
But
then,
can we do that? I mean,
yes,
isn't it ultimately the leadership's decision? They send the bill where they want to send it, right?
I have not.
You're one committee body, one
Yeah.
committee general assembly. So it was referred to this committee. Any other further reference has to be by vote of the body.
I think the Senate would vote to send it. I don't see how we would argue effectively that a bill placing requirements on farmers is not of proper interest to the agriculture committee. And I hate that. You understand, I'm not pushing for this to happen. I don't see how we, in good conscience, say no.
So, anyway, there's two ways to have a referral. One, the committee with possession refers it, and the other is to have it
Taken.
And so I think it's more collegial to refer. And if we have that agreement, I would like to refer. And I think for certain people, it'll be, they'll say, oh, well, the committee of jurisdiction that represents us, the farm community, heard it. And I think that could be helpful to all of us. And to your point about, well, could they have it anyway? I think the answer is probably yes. What's most disappointing to me is that there is information circulating that says farmers were not heard from, which is blatant misinformation. So then it's a problem when activists circulate misinformation.
Well, we have the Democratic caucus in a couple of minutes, and perhaps you should, as the chair of this committee, you should say that. Actually, I can go and get copies of the list of witnesses and hand them out.
See,
I think that for now, I'd rather not turn it into a caucus thing, just use the corner office to see if we just, rather than raise the profile, keep the profile calm and collegial and move it. But I think it's reasonable for us to expect timely handling of the bill.
the chair of agriculture offered to send the B bill over to the
B bill?
deals with fish and wildlife.
Yeah, the neonicotinoid bill?
Yeah.
No, I don't think we.
It should have come here. It came out of fish and wildlife and we got a virus.
I get it. They're, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So let me pursue it. Thank you for weighing in. And I'll do my best to protect our interests and facilitate a cordial movement of the bill to the floor on a timely basis.
Will be a buzz in the answers.
What's that?
We will all be a buzz in your answer.
Yeah, well,
I would recommend also to have the vice chair in meeting pro tem. So that somebody needs to be there with, I think it makes sense personally.
so I'll try to set something up. Are you available at all over lunch break?
I'd be happy to make myself available.
Another set of ears on this is good.
Yeah.
I'm happy. I think the most important thing is you, the chair of agriculture, and the president pro tem.
Okay, all right. Thank you for thinking aloud about this. I want to make sure that committee's comfortable with the course we take, and it is it's just irksome to be in a position where people misrepresent the work already done, and anyone who circulates misinformation is not helping good process or democracy.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
on an entirely separate matter, are we done with this?
Yes, we are.
I've had an inquiry about H 523, which deals with HFCs.
That
on our
will
board.
be next week. You know, as we can grab those little blocks of time, that's a very discrete package. The ones that are like that, just so that in case you're starting to hear about, so we have the petroleum cleanup fund that's like that, mercury lamps is like that. HFCs is like that. I think there's a fourth.
And that's gonna be scheduled sort of ad hoc now, this is
Yes.
the last
You
week.
know, maybe, so, well, let's do, we have a few moments, which is, does anyone know about their availability on Monday? I hate to ask for Monday, I'd rather,
Ed is meeting.
I can do it if I have to, I deliver, I do the work of the angels, Mr. Chairman, I deliver food to shut-ins on Monday.
do you know what the Probst is doing next Monday?
I would suspect that if we finish the bill by the end of the week, there'll be a conference committee meeting.
And you'll be on.
I
Probably.
have been in the past. That's up to the leadership.
Okay. Senator McDowell, have you heard anything about finance on Mondays? I haven't yet.
I don't know.
Okay, so if we were to schedule something on Monday, I would, Senator Campion, have you set a time for it?
We haven't. I've got to check with Chair of Health and Welfare since we overlap with so many committee members.
So maybe if we go on Monday, and it's a big if, so I would,
We'll know about finance today.
I would schedule it before or after another meeting that's already run to the State House or have you participate, so we.
Great.
Okay, great,
Usually first or late, but
right. Okay, great, thank you, everyone.
thank you.